Hi. We continue in 1 Samuel 12 today with the second part of Samuel's long speech to the Israelites. As you can see on the right side of the screen in the black and yellow chart, we've been working our way through this section of 1 Samuel 11 to 15, and noting the various ways that Samuel, on his own or on Yahweh's behalf or on behalf of somebody that the text doesn't tell us perhaps, is systematically trying to undermine Saul's monarchy here. Both Saul personally, as we'll see, and the monarchy in general, as we're seeing in this section. So we looked last time at the first part of Samuel's speech, which you can see here outlined, where in those first 5 verses he goes to great extents to justify himself, as he hasn't acted like a king. He hasn't taken their oxes or donkeys or taken anything by fraud, and we noted the triple use of the verb take, which is what he used when he told the people back in chapter 8 what a king would do: take, 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 take. So Samuel's justified himself now, and now the question is justifying Yahweh. And the way he does that is very interesting and brings up several issues that I'd like to discuss in this video. There are a couple of translation issues, because as we can see here in verse 6 in the New Revised Standard, it says, Samuel said to the people, "The Lord is witness who appointed Moses," but the verb there, asa, means to make. And so we're going to look at how the verb for make is sometimes covered over in the translation here and what that contrasts. We're also going to see how what he says down here is, "I will declare to you all the saving deeds of the Lord." And the word here is tzedakah, which can mean justice or righteousness or a variety of other things. So we're going to look at how that plays out in 1 Samuel as well. But another aspect of the overall picture is what we're going to see here is Samuel offering a brief summary of what he calls the tzedakah, or all tzedakah, all justice of Yahweh that he made for you and your ancestors. And yet it's very selective. He only tells a few pieces of the story. That may tell us something about when this book was written, or at least when this section was written, or it may just tell us something about Samuel's selectively choosing to remember certain things and bring them to the eyes and ears of the Israelites. And it brings up a bigger notion that is important to consider both in the Bible and how the Bible is used later and how we use history later, which is that when someone uses history to try to make a point about the present, we should always be a little suspicious about what's being said and what's not being said, the order in which things are being narrated, and the tone in which they're being narrated. Because clearly Samuel has an interest here. His interest is to show why he is innocent and why Yahweh is innocent and why the people are guilty. And so he's selectively highlighting things to make that point. Let's look at a comparison of a different telling after we just briefly look at what he says and what he doesn't say, and we're going to look back at it in detail. Just to glance through it, notice he starts with when Jacob went into Egypt, Jacob being a synonym for Israel. So the entire book of Genesis is gone there. Is that because the authors didn't know Genesis because it was written later? Perhaps, but at least they know that there was some kind of journey into Egypt. And so we hear that in half a verse, and then there's Moses and Aaron, and there's nothing about the wilderness, and nothing about Joshua, a couple things about Judges, and here, and then King Nahash of the Ammonites, and that's it. So I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with biblical history, to scan through Genesis and Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and see what's being left out there. So we can see this section here, and I'll bring that up to the center of the upper part of the screen here so we can see this in some detail. And we're going to look at that in some detail as we go. So let's go back up here at the beginning of this and work our way through this. So as we see in my note here, the purpose of the retelling of Israel's story is to provide the basis for an accusation against the people precisely for wanting a king. So he said to the people, again, and this is in contrast with all Israel in verse 1. Is that a different group? It's not clear. As the Lord is witness, and that's highlighting the fact that we saw witness here as well to the previous section, who made Moses and Aaron. And as my note down here has, his focus on these two leaders is usually thought to emphasize that they were personally chosen by Yahweh, in contrast to the king whom the people asked for. Thus Samuel will later mention the king whom you have chosen, for whom you asked. If this is the point, like all of Samuel's points, it is tendentious, since we might note that in response to the people's asking for a king, Yahweh specifically selects Saul, and in the following chapter, Samuel admits that Yahweh has chosen Saul. So just another example of the various contradictions that we've seen throughout this section, and that can slip past readers, and if they just assume that Samuel's speaking the word of Yahweh or trusting him just because he's a biblical character. Anybody who's worked in the Bible knows, worked in the Bible very long, knows that just because someone's a character in the Bible does not make them trustworthy. Whether that's a foreign oppressor, someone like Pharaoh, but even the people of Israel obviously have to face treachery and betrayal and lies amongst their own members. Otherwise, it would have been a nice, smooth journey all the way through, and we wouldn't have the inner and external conflicts that the Bible narrates. So here it has it as named, or as made rather, Moses and Aaron. Notice no distinction between them, and no sense of any of their history. No burning bush, no Moses being brought up under Pharaoh's daughter, any of that stuff. Brought your ancestors up out of the land of Egypt. But in fact, it was Joshua who did that, according to Deuteronomy 34, in the very beginning of Joshua. It wasn't Moses and Aaron who did that at all. And so we're already seeing that not only is he being selective, but he's skewing it to make his point here, focusing here on Moses and Aaron. So therefore, now take your stand. And we want to highlight here how the take your stand is echoing in both the beginning part and the end part. I'll bring up this making part here so we can see this as we go. So take your stand in 12:7, and exactly therefore take your stand in verse 16, among other parallels with that first part and second part. It's not that it's a chiasm, it's more that it's marking out separate units of chapter 12. So leaving that up for a minute so we can see that. So take your stand, which as many have noted is courtroom language, as my note from Rochelle Gilmore down below, so that I may enter into judgment with you. And this is Shaphat here, and yet here saving deeds is tzedakah, which is often translated as justice, and that's what creates the translation issue we see. So tzedakah is often paired with mishpat, and that's why I brought these up here in this chart. This is only some examples. For tzedakah, I used all the examples that were in the Deuteronomistic history. For mishpat, which there are many more, I did not. So you can see that tzedakah is 159 times in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, but only 17 in Deuteronomistic history. So about 10% of them are there. Notice that's in contrast here with mishpat, 424 overall and 86 in the Deuteronomistic history, which is about a fifth. So about 20% there and about only 10% here. So mishpat is used much more often in Deuteronomistic history, not only in absolute numbers, but in relative proportions of the entire Hebrew Bible. But what I really want to note is the different ways it's translated so we can get a sense of the range of things that it means. So in Genesis, it's used 3 times, in the classic verse that Paul relies on in Galatians, and it became a hinge for the Reformation, and he believed Yahweh, and Yahweh reckoned it to him as righteousness. So it's tzedakah there. But here, a couple chapters later, around Abraham, it's justice, and then with Jacob, it's honesty. So in English, those are 3 very different words. They obviously overlap, but honesty and justice are not necessarily the same, and neither is righteousness. Note, it's never used in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. So in the rest of the Torah, other than Deuteronomy, we don't find tzedakah. Then it's just a few times in Deuteronomy, here as in the right, twice as righteousness, and once as justice. So that can be confusing too. Never in Joshua, and only once in Judges, twice in the same verse, and they're translated as triumphs. Now, the translation issue is one thing. I'm not going to take us a step further and compare different translations in English of these things, but the New Revised Standard translators, I think, are representative of the fact that this word carries a range of meanings, and we need to pay attention to that. So, skipping over the blue part in Samuel just to finish the part in Deuteronomistic history. So we see it in 1 Kings only 3 times, and never in 2 Kings. In God's speech to Solomon in his dream, Yahweh says that Solomon is like his father David, practice righteousness, or tzedakah there, and that again here is righteousness, and again here is righteousness, here attributed to Solomon himself, along with justice, which is mishpat. So we see mishpat and tzedakah together there, as they often are. So in our passage, we see it here as saving deeds. It's only one other time in 1 Samuel, and that's as righteousness. This is a little typo here of one, just for Samuel in general, as righteousness. In 2 Samuel, David is described as administering justice and equity, mishpat and tzedakah, but instead of other translations as righteousness, here it's equity. Here it's right. As in English language, we hear that especially in the U.S. as like the Bill of Rights or legal rights, and then here is righteousness. So equity, right, and righteousness in 2 Samuel. So it's a little tricky to hear what's happening here, but it's important to pay attention because this is what Samuel is claiming is what he's declaring to them. is the tzedakah of Yahweh. So we have to understand what it is that he's supposed to be pointing out about Yahweh's behavior. So here it is, whether it's righteousness or saving deeds or equity, the behavior of Yahweh that is in contrast with the behavior of the Israelites is the point here. So let's see the examples he gives of that kind of behavior. So he starts here with Jacob, and I note here no mention of Joseph, and I'll contrast that in a minute. In fact, why don't I just do that now? With another speech like this. This is the speech of Stephen in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament after Jesus' death and resurrection, and he's in Jerusalem testifying. And there are a couple things I want to show you about this. First of all, note how long it is. It goes on this long, a page and a half, whereas what we, in my sense of pages, whereas in 1 Samuel it's only a few verses. But what I've highlighted is what Stephen includes, and especially things that are not included in Samuel's summary here. Stephen has a different purpose. He's trying to highlight here that God is not confined to Jerusalem or confined to temples, and that people have often been misled by their leaders who were not on Yahweh's side. So he's making some different points, but notice what he does. He starts with Abraham. He doesn't start with the Garden of Eden. He doesn't start with any of what we might call the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 12, but he starts with Abraham. He's skipping Isaac, doesn't mention any of the women who are very important in Genesis, notes Jacob, notes a lot about Joseph, and so all of this part is Genesis. Then he gets to Moses and talks about Moses' birth and his experience, and notice how much is Moses here, or only up to the burning bush here, and then we're in Mount Sinai in the wilderness, and then he continues on to the time of Joshua. It mentions David once in passing, mentions Solomon once in passing, and then he's done. It doesn't mention Saul at all, which is curious, or Samuel. So very different kind of speech. And what Stephen leaves in and leaves out tells us a lot about what Luke's goal is in Acts of the Apostles, as well as the character Stephen there. So Joseph is left out. All of Genesis is left out. My view of that is, although scholars disagree about this, is that Genesis was written much later. Although this section has a hint of being later than some of the other parts, because Moses is hardly ever mentioned at all in the books of Samuel. Moses and Aaron are mentioned here, but Moses is hardly ever mentioned, which suggests that either the memory of Moses has been repressed, or Samuel just doesn't want to talk about Moses. We see that note here. So only here in verse 6 and verse 8 in all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, only mentioned a few times in 1 Kings. And most scholars would attribute that to being later insertions by a Deuteronomistic editor later. And again, as I've been saying throughout this section, I don't want to get lost in digging up sources and deciding which verses and which passages are from which sources. Scholars spend an enormous amount of energy on that, and that's not what I want to do here. But it is important to highlight that if Samuel's leaving out Genesis, it may be because the authors of this passage simply didn't have Genesis to work with yet. But maybe they did, and he's just choosing not to talk about that, because much of Genesis, where there's no king and no leadership at all, would go against even Samuel's authority as a judge. And Samuel is certainly one to claim authority. He might not want a human king to have authority, but he certainly wants himself to have divinely given authority. So, witness who made Moses and Aaron and brought the ancestors up out of the land of Egypt. Note the entire Exodus is left out here. So the entire struggle in the Exodus, the covenant, Mount Sinai, all that is left out. It seems to be leaving out because it suggests that the Israelites could experience God directly and don't need an intermediary like Samuel to explain to them what's going on here. Immediately go to his theme. They forgot Yahweh their God and sold them into the hand of Sisera. But why start with Sisera? Why start with Judges 4:2? Why not the entire book of Joshua, which is part of the Deuteronomistic history, and highlight their struggle and their worshiping other gods and all the ways that we've already seen an example of the Ammonites being echoed from Joshua as having been sent by Yahweh to punish the Israelites for worshiping the gods of their neighbors. But here it's not about idolatry, it's about forgetting, which is a key Deuteronomistic theme, and we see that here. Certainly Deuteronomy 8 is a classic example of that. We see the number of times it's used right there. And of course Samuel's whole thing is about they have forgotten. They've forgotten that Yahweh is their king. Whether they've forgotten or not, or they just choose to act otherwise, is one subject to interpretation, but he's making it a matter of forgetting. So they forgot Yahweh their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera. A strange way to put it, as if Yahweh was getting paid for that, which is obviously a metaphor. but suggesting that this was Yahweh's doing. Commander of the army of King Jabin of Hazor, which is an astounding amount of detail, given how little is said about other elements of the history here. Why name this king in such detail there? And especially just generically the Philistines and the Moabites that follow. And I would encourage you again as readers to look back and see what else isn't being named among Ammonites and other local peoples that are named in the book of Joshua and Judges as people they had to struggle against. But Samuel's not trying to go into a long history, even though this is his words for the entire chapter here, with one exception when the Israelites respond and cry out for mercy. But he's just trying to set a theme. So God led them out. They forgot. They got handed over to an enemy. They cried out and admitted they've sinned and call out to Yahweh for rescue. A pretty standard Deuteronomistic summary here. Of what the story is and the relationship between Yahweh and the Israelites. So this is the first time that they say they've sinned. We've seen chatat, the verb for sinning, here several times already, a couple times, and we see it a number of times later. But here's the first time that they do it. As we see in my note here, of all the times when Israel cried out to Yahweh for help in Judges, only once did they ever confess their sin, and that's at Judges 10:10. So they do it here right away. And they do it in words beyond what Samuel had accused them of. They say, we have sinned because we have forsaken Yahweh and have served the Baals and the Astartes, which he didn't accuse them of. This is a standard assumption, as we see here in Judges, and we see it also in Joshua. But Samuel hadn't brought it up. They brought it up, which is a curious thing here. And it contrasts the serve them and will serve you. As Stussy notes, how ironic it is that they now describe themselves as Samuel's servants, having served other gods. The Baals and the Astartes represent the male and female pair of many of the local Canaanite gods there, and referred to regularly throughout the wilderness story and often in the prophets as well. So now they're calling for, currently having named what they did in the past, now they call for rescue. Notice a different word, not the Yeshua word that we saw that Saul had done and what they were looking for, what the people of Jabesh Gilead were looking for, but a little different word here. Rescue us from the hand of our enemies. This is the first time we're seeing enemies here. It's 93 times in Deuteronomistic history, though, of 285 in the Masoretic text. A third of the times Deuteronomistic history is very much oriented around the question of enemies, and hence a monarchy to fight against enemies. So what enemies they have now isn't clear, since the Ammonites have been defeated, though, and Saul had successfully shown that he could do that. This is, of course, a crying out from the ancestors, but Samuel's certainly projecting that into the time of the situation before them, too. So he continues here, naming some of the judges. Notice the summary here from the New Testament text of Hebrews that is a similar thing, and a very selective list of the judges. Notice he leaves out Deborah, the female judge, precisely the one who took on the issue that was named earlier of whose hand they were sent into. But Zerubbabel, Barak, Jephthah, and at least Samson here in the Septuagint. But in the Hebrew it says Shemuel, Samuel. I guess the Septuagint, and most scholars would agree, changed that because they wouldn't probably expect Samuel to talk about himself in the third person. But Samson was hardly someone who rescued them from anybody. Samson, if anybody knows that story, was concerned with himself. And Jephthah is the one who horribly made the vow that the first person that would come out of his house, if he won the victory, would die, and that was his daughter. And we've already seen that one referred to with the echo of Bezak earlier. So it's a very strange selection of judges. But he claims here that Yahweh sent you these and rescued from your enemies on every side, just as they called for, and lived in safety. Batah, or a rare word in the Deuteronomistic history, echoing Deuteronomy 12:10 here, and only a couple of other times. And then he comes toward the conclusion here with again a strange summary. When you saw King Nahash of the Ammonites, so a couple of things here. For this is the first time that Nahash has been called a king. When we looked earlier at this, the beginning of chapter 11, it simply said Nahash of the Ammonites came and encamped near Jabesh Gilead and threatened to gouge out the right eyes of everybody. And it's Samuel who names him as a king. So he starts here, when you saw that King Nahash of the Ammonites came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us. But any reader of the text knows that's not what happened at all. we go back and look at chapter 8, and we'll see they said, you've grown old and your sons are corrupt, and we want to have a king like all the other nations. It had nothing to do with Nahash or the Ammonites. If anything, it had to do with the Philistines. So Samuel is not only selectively telling the story, he's plainly skewing the story against what we just saw, let alone what readers or hearers going to other texts might discover if they did the digging. And the figure of speech, I mean, the way the phrase is used here, this actual speech is also not accurate, but that's a smaller detail compared to the factual inaccuracy. And so then he concludes here with verse 13, at least for this moment, and then we'll pick up with verse 14 next time in this last part of his speech. So see here another Gehenna. We saw all the four hennas in the first three verses, that behold word. Here is the king whom you have chosen. Notice that who he said earlier, whom I set over you, or who Yahweh set over you. Now it's whom you have chosen. But they didn't choose Saul at all. Yahweh chose Saul. And so they had no choice in the matter. Samuel pointed out and said, here is the one whom Yahweh has given you. So many things going on in Samuel's speech to question. For whom you have asked, which is the ongoing play on the words on Saul. So Shaul, for whom you have Sauled. And finally, one last Gehenna here. The Lord has set a king over you. Summarizing what we see here that was echoing, they set a king over you here. But notice here it was Samuel said, I have set the king over you. And here he says, Yahweh has set the king over you. But here he said, you chose the king. That you called for a king and you picked it. So again, it's very confusing, and maybe that's the point, is that whether Samuel's confused or the writers are confused or the Israelites are confused, as we heard from one of our Ian Wilson's book on history and memory, the plot of this whole section is confused, but no matter how you try to unsort it, it ends up with monarchy. And we'll see what Samuel has to say to the Israelites about picking a king in our next unit. See you then. Bye-bye.